there will be capital destruction where there has been all of this irrational exuberance. It's not if, it is when. And the fear is that people in the future will say, like, well, mining's uninvestable. So let's just not invest in mining.
All right, Ashley. So critical minerals underpin basically everything we like to talk about on Mission Critical. You can't build batteries, you can't build defense systems, you can't build the grid infrastructure for AI without critical minerals. And I feel like yet, many Americans have no idea how dependent we are on countries like China and other supply chains for these minerals. So you spent a decade in the space, building mines, deploying billions in government capital, now getting into other deals in the public markets. Before we get into your background, let's just set the table for us. Like, how bad is this dependency problem? And I guess just like, why should people care about it?
Yes, so excellent overview. There's an old adage in the mining space that if you can't grow it, you have to mine it. And I think there's almost been a bit of a reckoning in society, or certainly a significant amount of awareness that the building blocks of all of our technologies, of all the things that we love about modern life, they have to come out of the ground. And we've spent the last several decades here in the US with a little bit more of a NIMBY mindset, so not in my backyard. And we've let mines and processing go to other countries where we don't have to think about or witness the environmental implications. And we've been very happy just to buy those end products and live our lives and away we go, right? And like as the music is playing, like the people will be dancing. And I think really what we've seen is through all of this outsourcing, the CCP within China has been able to take a very long-term strategic view around really building out and monopolizing those industries, those building blocks of critical technologies. And we as the West, like we absolutely let it happen. We were asleep at the wheel. If you look at kind of the broad list of critical minerals, look at the USGS list, the DOE list, like whatever list you want to look at, far and away, upwards of 80% of those materials come out of China. Even if it's not mined in China, it is processed in China. And so
Right.
very much the chokehold, the choke point is within the PRC. And we've seen with things like export bans or export limitations that if a global conflict broke out, the US likely wouldn't be able to supply our defense industrial base. And that is a terrifying proposition.
100%. And, I feel like just in the time I've been paying attention to current events, geopolitics, this problem in particular, I feel like there's kind of a grumbling about this that picked up, gosh, years ago. And then AI has just like amplified it because of kind of the infrastructure build out that we're now kind of staring down as a country. And then, of course, the Ukraine conflict, I feel like brought that into clearer focus as well. And man, we really aim to talk about the foundations that our future is built on. And I can't imagine one that's more critical, more important than these critical minerals. But I want to dive into your background. You've like I mentioned, you spent almost a decade or more than a decade in this space, and you've had such an interesting career arc from petroleum engineer to Department of Energy deputy director, and so many other things in between there. Just kind of talk us through how you got into this space, where it started, and how it's kind of meandered to where you are now.
It has been certainly the weird and the wonderful across my career. And looking back, I think it's easy to tell a coherent story around how it all happened. But I'm someone who's broader than I am deep. And I personally really like that approach to business. So you're exactly right. My background's petroleum engineering from a small town in Oklahoma. First job out of undergrad, I was a drilling engineer at ExxonMobil, which I loved. I love being operational. I'm boots on the ground. I am in the details. Like, that's me. That has always been me. For better or for worse, that will always be me. And I did 28 days on the rig and then 28 days off work. Just a
Wow.
great schedule when you're like 21. But I wanted to be more entrepreneurial. So loved the oil business, loved being operational, but like I was at a huge company, right? And so ended up going and getting an MBA. And I met a guy named Rhett Bennett, not through my MBA program, but through networking. He's actually a Kentucky guy. But met Rhett in Fort Worth through a fund called Natural Gas Partners. And he is like incredibly successful serial oil and gas entrepreneur, young guy, younger at the time. Obviously, we've aged like a decade, but I thought like, hey, if I want to learn how to do this, like that's the guy that I want to learn from. I'm a huge believer in mentorship and positioning yourself to learn the most, not necessarily just like get brand names. Like a lot to be said for brand names. Like, I went to Harvard Business School, right? But it's certainly not the end all be all. Like you really need to focus on learning and like having skills, right? So went to work for Rhett. It was a bizarre timing. It was between the time I signed the offer letter and joined the company, he sold Black Mountain Oil and Gas One for $700 million. It was an amazing deal. It was like kind of early days of West Texas oil and gas private equity. And like off to the races, right? So I showed up and I was like, hey man, what do you want me to do here? And to his credit, I like hats off to Rhett. He empowered me to say like, I don't know, like, what do you think is next for Black Mountain? And we went off on what was at the time, this is 2017. It was a very weird journey into critical minerals. And we took the approach that we wanted to be the hay in the barn, not the horse on the track for electrification. So we didn't necessarily want to like go back a battery chemistry or a battery company, but we wanted to supply the stuff that everyone needed. So did look, very long story how it all came together. I ended up mostly moving to Perth. We raised about $75 million and started a nickel business called Black Mountain Metals. We exited much of Black Mountain Metals in 2021 to a fund out of London. And then, as everyone else did in 2021, we IPO'd a SPAC. So it's called Metals Acquisition Corp. It was a group of all-star mining people, like my best mentors in the space. CEO was a guy named Mick McMullen. Chair was a guy named Nev Power, who's like the guy. He was like Australian of the Year. He built this enormous mining company called Fortescue, like amazing. And just an absolute privilege to work with them. We ended up doing a deal to buy an operating copper mine from Glencore. It was called CSA for $1.1 billion. And closed that June 15 of 23. I stayed on for 6 months post de-SPAC just to help make it a public company. It's very different being a public cash box versus an operating public copper mining company. And I like did what I could, right, to help, although like very experienced executives, and I can't take credit for that. I learned a lot. Ended up transitioning into government, which again is like a weird right-hand turn. I came in as a Fed. I was not a political appointee. Why that matters, I'll tell you in a second. But I came in as an SES, so Senior Executive Service. When I took the job, I said, I will come in specifically to deploy this capital. Like they needed someone that had an investment skill set, had kind of knowledge of the supply chain, like could look at it through an investor's lens to come in and deploy bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act capital, right? So I said, I will come in, I will do this job, I will build out the system. And then as soon as the money is allocated, like I'm going back to Texas. Nobody needs me to be in government long term. Certainly not me. It's like I'm not a great fit for government. I'm like not great with bureaucracy and all the things. I'm like entrepreneur, right? And so honestly, net positive experience. Like have such an appreciation for DC, have a really great network there, just best people trying so hard to solve our nation's most pressing challenges on a shoestring budget. Like just like hats off to all of our federal workers. They have like an impossible job. We ended up doing 6 billion in grants and 10 billion in tax credits, most of which survived a big beautiful bill. So it really does show how bipartisan critical minerals are. Something I'm very proud of. I feel like I didn't waste my year. But here we are, here we are. And I moved back to Texas as promised, right? As promised. I was like, I'm out of here. So I formally resigned in like October of 24, left in January of 25. So moved back to Austin. I took like a quote, a sabbatical. I'm shit at taking a sabbatical, by the way, is what we learned. I like drove myself. I was busier than I'd ever been in my life. I was like going insane. I need something to do. But ended up starting a family office, like invested in some mining stuff kind of personally, which actually has turned out quite well. Had my second baby in May 30th. Her name's Penelope, but we call her Poppy, and she's perfect in every way. And then in June, was connected to a guy named Steven Silver, who's an Australian. He's CEO of Evolution Capital to launch some SPACs. So it started off as one SPAC. We finalized the IPO mid-November. It's called Evolution Global Acquisition Corp. NASDAQ ticker is EVOX. $240 million. It turned into two SPACs. So the second SPAC is a partnership with M Resources, led by an Australian billionaire named Matt Lattimore. But they're really active met coal traders, operators. They own infrastructure, like incredibly fascinating. That IPO closed last week. $300 million. It's called MEVO Global Acquisition Corp 2. NASDAQ ticker is MEVO. So I'm COO and director of those. It's very much my full-time focus. And then love to give unsolicited opinions on critical mineral policy.
I love it. I love it. Well, and that too, I mean, that's a heck of a background. Definitely something to be proud of. And for everybody that works for the federal government, I come from the local government side for a couple of years ago, mostly focusing on like site selection, economic development policy for manufacturing here in Louisville, Kentucky. But for anybody that dedicates at some part of their life to serving the rest of the country, I definitely really appreciate that as a citizen. And so thank you for all that you've done, even though it was a short stint, about
A year.
yeah. So even with that, the impact you can have in a short amount of time is whatever you want to put into it. And it sounds like you put a lot into this process. And so we really appreciate that. Um, and I feel like that perspective of yours, just going back, I mean, all the way from growing up in Oklahoma through where you are now, I've had that history and that perspective lends itself to a huge asset for the federal government. And so I'm not sure how the process of you joining the Department of Energy actually happened, if that was more of a conversation with whoever was leading the sector, the agency, or somebody else working in it. I'm very curious about that. And then I'm also curious, just up from your perspective, looking at, so you worked in the Biden administration for a year and now looking at the Trump administration, talk about longevity of policy, but also there's two different approaches to what we're trying to do here. And you have, I feel like, good perspectives on both on the private side and then working under the Biden administration. And so how did the whole federal government opportunity even come up? How does that work? And then what are your thoughts on the two different administrations, how they're approaching it, and just general thoughts on that, since you have such a good perspective on it?
So if you go in as a political appointee, you're like appointed by the president. And so someone reaches out to you. There's a vetting process. Sometimes you have to be vetted by Congress, just kind of like depends on level. And then you're a political appointee, right? Boom. I'm like 100% sure there's more to it, but like that is, the process. I came in as a Fed. So there are some restrictions associated with being a political appointee, including you're not allowed to like direct capital. So political appointees could not be involved in making decisions on who gets grants, and evaluating grant applications. And so they needed a Fed who had investment expertise, who could be involved in the process and was separate from like the political stuff, right? Like if you carry it to an extreme, if a political appointee could direct funds, they could potentially direct funds to donors, et cetera, right? It's not good optics, so they don't do it. It's like very much walled off and like separate. So I was a Fed. And that's why that's so important for me to emphasize. I was sent a job description. So it's literally like fedjobs.com or like USA, I can't remember, I don't know. I applied for it and there was like a very long vetting process. I bet I applied in like June of 23, right when we were closing the DSPAC. It took me until January of 24 to get in the door.
Wow.
So it was like interviews. You have to disclose everything you own down to like $20 increments. My husband did too. Like, I mean, it was an ordeal. So it was a competitive process. I applied, I was chosen, and I was onboarded. We sold our house in Fort Worth, moved to DC fully. So we were like fully on board. Biden versus Trump happened. Very different approaches, very same goal. So, critical minerals and onshoring manufacturing, like that's extremely bipartisan. It feels like that is like the original Americana, right? Like making things here, like having jobs, everybody gets behind it, right? Like controlling our own destiny, fueling our own defense industrial base. Now, very different approaches, right? So with the Biden administration, they had two landmark pieces of legislation, bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act. What that did was it allowed Congress to appropriate large buckets of capital to very specific and targeted purposes. It was all delineated in the bill. And the positive of that is it's very transparent. You can see exactly how much money there is, where it's coming from, what it's going to. The very real negative of that is like the process is very slow. It takes like 9 months from application to grant selection, and I won't even go through all of why, but it does legitimately take about 9 months to get through all the processes and the checks and the balances. And oftentimes it's not exactly fit for purpose. And the folks who are writing these bills have great intentions, very smart, very policy minded, maybe not commercial, maybe not fully across what the needs are for critical minerals. And so there's a trade-off there, right? And it was very much geared towards stimulating downstream needs, i.e., there was within IRA, there was a Section 30D tax credit, which was an EV tax credit. And the thought process was if you have enough EVs, you can get scale and you can justify large battery facilities. And then if you back your way up the supply chain, you have enough scale to justify underwriting these other assets, right? So you're working backwards from an endpoint. Flip to the Trump album. Much of the Inflation Reduction Act was repealed, including 30D, which like I'm pretty like straight down the middle politically. I like don't feel strongly about 30D. But it was repealed. This is a fact. And so what it means is automakers who were relying on 30D and the signals from the federal government to build out EV infrastructure all of a sudden were left without that tax credit. And like we're seeing it. Like Stellantis just had a huge write-off. Like we've seen all of the write-offs that are coming from these EV investments. What the Trump administration is doing really well, so they're taking it kind of opposite side. They are supporting the front end of the supply chain. And it's mostly coming out of the Department of War. And like credit to those guys. They are private sector animals and are structuring deals that like look like they're coming out of a bank. Like I'm very impressed with how fit for purpose and like structured they're making these transactions. Um, they're given a lot of flexibility. Basically, they have very flexible capital and a wide mandate. They've been taking equity stakes in assets. They, in the case of MP Materials, put in place a price floor. They're doing off takes, like a lot of things that would have never been possible under the construct of Bill and Myra, because that is very limited specific capital, right? The challenge. So like everything, there is no right answer here. Like we are in a very precarious situation, and like moving the ball down the field is good. Like just keep moving, right? Everything has trade-offs. The flip side of this is, let's say we build a lithium mine. All right, well, maybe we have lithium carbonate. Who's gonna make those batteries? Like, we've had to shut down all of our factories, right? And so are we just gonna ship that to China? Like, so now we're like relying on China as an off-taker? That's not great either. We don't want them to supply, but we don't want to be reliant on them for offtake either. So like double-edged sword. The other challenge, Bill and Ira is a slow process. It was like, I would rather scoop my eyeballs out with spoons than like do it again. However, you're starting to see like congressional inquiries around like how are some of these deals being struck. I imply no negativity. I just think it's gonna be like a little bit of an uphill battle, like proving all the boxes were checked. And so that's a challenge, right? Now, I do think some of the developments from last week are quite relevant here, because historically we had been seeing one-off deals. Like, the federal government was taking an equity stake in one company and a price floor for one company. So it might not be, but it feels like they're picking winners, right? As opposed to kind of like addressing the challenges in the market, like the actual market plumbing. But last week they took some really interesting steps to try to address that. So they announced um quite a substantial, I want to say it was 12 billion. It was definitely over 10, less than 15. Anyway, like you get it. Big. It's called Project Vault. And it's kind of an addendum to the historic Department of War stockpiles, which are used specifically for military purposes. The intent of Project Vault is basically to be able to offtake and supply nascent US infrastructure. Because if you have interdependency risk across these assets, they're basically impossible to finance because it's not bankable. Like you have an offtake agreement from something that hasn't been built. Like, cool, it's not bankable. But if Project Vault steps in between, that makes it bankable, right? Great, cool. However, it does zero good to anyone if you make it bankable, but the unit economics still don't work, which is like what we're up against, right? And there was last week, they had like a ministerial, which is like a very, mysterious phrase, but basically the US is working to establish a new trading bloc to effectively put in place synthetic price floors. So think Section 232 tariffs, but for the entire block. Devil's going to be in the details. We have no information on how this is going to work. I like the concepts and like credit where credit's due. I think they're like giving it their all. So I really hope implementation is great.
Right. And so on that, especially being on the private side of things, how does everything over the past week, let alone since January 2025, how does that affect your all's investment decision making? Are you all approaching it the same way as if it is what it is, or do I feel like you really have to take a step back and try to grasp what the federal government's trying to do and how that's going to affect you guys, because you guys play on a global scale.
So like, absolutely. You need to understand what is happening. both what is happening in reality, what the intent is, kind of like where the moving pieces are. I think if we've learned anything, it is extremely hard to invest on the back of policy, particularly if it's going to ping pong every 4 years. And like, you know, I would love if, we had some great solutions under Trump and they just continued on, right? Unfortunately, just how politicized everything has become and like how far apart things are. I think the fear is, somebody with a different ideology than Trump gets elected next, and all of this goes away, and there's like another new approach, which is a valid approach, but maybe we just need to keep like whatever we're doing, right? And so I think people are scared. People are there's like a lot of fear in the market. 30D is like a perfect example. Like people just blew themselves up off the back of that being repealed. And so I personally would be quite scared. Unless I had some sort of binding agreement, like MP Materials, they've gone to great lengths to prove that they have like a binding agreement with the Department of War. I wouldn't be worried if I was them. You just need to ensure that you're not investing on the hope of a policy staying in place. You need like robust market mechanisms that ensure that you remain profitable.
I just find all of that, it's just so complex, but it's so interesting. I mean, we could spend hours going down any one of those rabbit holes on how that affects the market dynamics. And, the one that I kind of wanted to draw a thread to is how the CCP plays into this. It seems like that's the one that kind of really influences what's going on in the country. Is, I think you put it in our intro call, when you have a centralized actor like the CCP that doesn't really care about profits, it's just makes it really difficult to kind of lay out things in more of a capitalistic way in America. So I'd like to just go down that rabbit hole and then kind of tie that, as we talk about capitalism, tying that into what you called irrational exuberance in this space currently. So I'll let you kind of take that and work that in how you see fit. But I think starting with the role that the China plays in this whole market, I think is a good place to jump off from.
Yep. Okay. So decades in the making. This is not something that, we woke up and said like, oh man, like in the last year, like we've fallen behind, right? It's like literally 30 years. The CCP, so the Chinese Communist Party, when you become a bureaucrat, you get all of these like very like fancy acronyms that they like becomes part of your vernacular. So like CCP and PRC are like People's Republic of China, Chinese Communist Party. Anyway, you hear me say them. I never would have said them pre-bureaucrat, but sometimes things just stick with you, Anyway, so China took a very strategic view that it was going to be one of the foundations of their economy. They are government directed, right? Government directed capital. It's not normal market forces like capitalism. And so what we've seen is China has been able to build out enormous scale, like enormous scale. If you Google, this is the nerdiest thing to Google, but Google like videos of some of like a flyover of some of their battery factories, and it is like horrifying, astounding, impressive. Like we are not doing that here. So of course we're behind, right? Anyway, so they have enormous scale, kind of all the way across the supply chain. We all have heard about China's Belt and Road strategy, getting very close with basically the global south, giving loans, giving support in exchange for access to their resources, right? So they have well and truly kind of infiltrated across the supply chain. It is hard to do anything in the mining space and certainly the critical minerals space without coming up against China. Now, specifically for a lot of these like defense critical minerals, the tiny markets, the all the rare earths that you hear so much about, neodymium, praseodymium, and even things like antimony, tungsten, like kind of like smaller niche markets, not broadly traded. Um, this is where the problem truly sits. It, it, it there aren't global exchanges that trade these materials. They're very thinly traded, often on spot prices out of China. And so what that means is, let's say, actually, good example. In the 2000s, Japan was looking to set up kind of a rare earth operation. China ended up flooding the market such that prices came down. Japan's rare earth industry collapsed because they need to make money. And then China consolidated further and like continued to be the only game in town. That's monopolistic behavior, but it's also state-backed monopolistic behavior. And one of my business school professors, he always said, all bleeding must stop, like one way or another, which is very true, unless you're looking at like, I mean, look, eventually the bleeding must stop with China, that they can certainly outweigh our companies that need to make returns on a quarterly basis, right? And so we've seen it for the last 20 years. Every time a Western operation tries to stand up, China can artificially manipulate the price, and we can't compete. We can't compete. Plain and simple. And so what ends up happening is, again, China further consolidates monopoly and gets more power, right? So that's why this trading block is quite interesting and important, because it puts in place those price floors that China would not be able to manipulate, and it allows investors to underwrite some sort of floor for their investment position. What was the next part of the question?
Yeah, just connecting that to some of the irrational exuberance going on in the space. And you kind of mentioned the point of, a little too much hype leading to capital destruction, damaging the reputation of the industry, that whole dynamic.
This is one of my big soapboxes is like, and look, I am so happy that retail investors are involved in the market. I think it's great that people invest in the market and create wealth for themselves and control destiny. Like, awesome. What I worry so much is, last year, for example, all of 2025, we heard so much about rare earths, rare earths, rare earths, rare earths. And so there aren't a ton of ways to play that thematic in public markets. And so we saw the retail investors just flooding into some of these stocks, without the ability to truly kind of diligence what the underlying assets were. Market capitalizations like ballooned like crazy. And the worry is like, and this happened, right? This happens in the commodity space. Like, something gets sexy for a minute and people like flood it, and then everybody loses their money and then blames that commodity. And so the worry is like, there will be capital destruction where there has been all of this irrational exuberance. It's not if, it is when. And the fear is that people in the future will say like, well, mining's uninvestable. So let's just not invest in mining. Let's invest in something else. And that's what's been happening. Like, if you look at the total market cap of the major mining companies, like, and then compare that like Home Depot. I think the entire mining industry has like a lower market cap than Home Depot. If you look at oil and gas, yes, if you look at oil and gas majors versus like mining majors, it's like sad. It's kind of sad. Because you think of like Rio, and like the big guys as like being like, the like big companies on the block, they have great balance sheets. Really, they don't. Like, if you look at the balance sheet of something like Exxon, they have access to so much more capital. And so in general, mining is undercapitalized. The last thing we need is for people to destroy capital and then make it even less capitalized, right? So I simply encourage caution and diligence on making these types of investments. And that goes for funds too. I can tell you how many funds have reached out and they're like, so rare earths, like, how do we get involved? And I'm like, oh my, yeah, like, oh my God, there are other
Yeah.
metals, people. Like, it is not just rare earths. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a realist view of it, and I appreciate that so much when it's so easy to get swept up in like the meme stock sort of
I know. I
craze
know.
of things.
It's a thing. It's a thing.
I wanted this is more so like very kind of future looking, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts on it of we're in this moment where things are changing incredibly rapidly from a technological standpoint with artificial intelligence. And my my prediction from where I'm sitting is I think the next thing that's going to kind of hit us really hard as a society is robotics. We're kind of you can think of large language models as building the brains essentially of these robots that are likely going to come on the scene soon. I'm curious if you think about that much and how that affects market dynamics. If now, does that change the economics at all of mining? If maybe a lot of them are mostly automated. I'm just curious, like, where can that sort of technological leverage be applied to this entire sector? If you've thought about that much.
Yeah. So the honest truth is I don't spend a tremendous amount of time thinking about that. Let me tell you what I do, like the onflows of what you just said from my vantage point. Mining is like notoriously anti-technology. It's just like it's like fucking hard to get a mine financed. And
It's
then
crazy.
you overlay some like untested technology, and banks are like, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing this? And so it ends up being like quite antiquated, right? Like oil and gas has much more advanced technology than mining. That being said, there are some operations that are starting to kind of go the autonomous route. Autonomous trucks, autonomous monitoring, particularly around safety implications, like wall stability, monitoring operations. Like you're starting to see this, right? You're also starting to see it a lot on the processing side, like real time kind of testing, like what's coming out and how things are different between batches, etc. Like you're seeing it, right? I would say it's like probably the minority of operations. Although I would be happy to be proven wrong. I would be so happy to. It's generally kind of the larger companies, the larger mines. So for example, in the Pilbara in Western Australia, it's like big iron ore mines. Fortescue is a big player. They are actively working through kind of autonomous systems in autonomous trucking. But it's like huge operations that can underwrite these kinds of investments. Really, where it goes for me is like, I have like a rat brain where it's, one of those like, okay, so, what is the world going to need more of? And it's copper. Like it's copper. It's copper all day long. Like everybody always talks about the Robert Friedland quote that it's like, we need more copper in the next like 10 years than humanity has mined in all of history or something. It's definitely the wrong stat, but it's something like that. Like the guy has several zingers that everybody always use. Like all of this stuff, anything that requires more electricity, kind of more functioning, like you need more copper. And I cannot underscore how unclear it is where that copper is going to come from. So I think operating copper mines or even like development stage copper mines are incredible investments. With my first SPAC, we bought an operating copper mine from Glencore. Great, great, love it, love it. There's not a tremendous amount of exploration activity. And in general, like the pace at which mines get built simply like cannot keep up with that. So it's a question of like how high are prices going to go before you start seeing substitution to something else. But those prices will be so elevated at that stage that it almost comes full circle around like well, maybe it doesn't make sense to go down this autonomous pathway. Like, I genuinely believe that copper is like the final boss of energy transition, of electrification. I think it's going to be the governor on how quickly we can adopt these things. Um, I think prices only go up from here.
I'm just very curious around where you're optimistic outside of copper, like more holistically with this global ecosystem, because I feel like there is a lot to be pessimistic about. And so you mentioned focus, you mentioned copper, but also at the same time with this recent ministerial, I feel like it's at least a really good first step to trying to address this problem and creating a little bit more of a self-reliant future is how I'll say it. But from my perspective too, and we're over the next couple of weeks going to have another guest more so in the metals recycling space. And so to be able to
Cool.
keep the material in circulation longer, um, A, just more generally, where are you optimistic in this space? Because it is such a big hill to climb, but also B, how does the recycling of the metals within the ecosystem, how does that help us start taking off a little bit one at a time?
The least popular thing right now is like first principles investing. I feel like everybody is doing like meme stocks and like crazy stuff. Like, I think it goes back to there are interesting opportunities in every commodity. Every commodity, as long as you understand what you're investing in, right? As long as you are doing proper diligence on the mine plan, you understand where the risks are. Like, there are ways to get exposure if you do the correct analysis, right? So I'll say that more broadly. And I like obviously like copper. But everyone likes copper. This is like not novel. Literally everyone will tell you that they like copper. Even gold miners like copper, and like that really says something. I do kind of like the kind of subset of like defense critical minerals. I think if you're looking at where the Trump administration is going to be heavy-handed, I think they'll go defense critical minerals over battery critical minerals initially. Although when you're looking at Project Vault and the ministerial, that will also impact battery critical materials. Like I think opportunities abound, truly, but buyer beware. You need to understand what it is you're investing in. So across the space, you can find opportunities. Recycling. Um, I'm not a I say that with such like disdain. I'm not a naysayer in any way. I think it's great. Like, let's recycle. I just I I cannot tell you how many conversations I've had where people are like, we're gonna recycle our way out of this. Like, might drop, problem solved. And it we're not. So we're not. It's not that straightforward. I think it is a great option for additional supply in the future, particularly things that are regularly scrapped, like your coppers, for example. Boy, we're recycling it, right? I met a guy who's like a tungsten scrapper. Cool, like cool, but anyway, like there's so much to be done in that space, and I think it's really cool and interesting. Where it gets challenging is, and we have seen this unfortunately play out kind of across the industry, but it's where it gets more challenging is when it's maybe a new recycling process or it's hard to recover the materials out of it. So for example, we've seen, unfortunately, like a bit of a reckoning across the battery recycling supply chain. We saw Li-Cycle, which was one of the early kind of public comps. Um, it, it kind of implode in like a little bit of a spectacular fashion. And I think what we're learning is like Redwood, who had a ton of glow, like they're pivoting in a little bit of a different direction than pure recycling. And so I'm not saying it's impossible by any means. Like there are so many smart people, and somebody's going to crack the code. I think the question is who, how, at what cost, and what materials will actually be recovered. Um, I think there will be a lot of consolidation in this space. Like, I think it's hard. I think it's hard. There's also very active efforts in permanent magnet recycling, which again, I think is great because we have very limited rare earth supply. But great. It's non-trivial. And there are groups that are attacking it, and I absolutely wish them well. I do think capital has flown into that space. So hopefully they're cashed up and de-risking their tax and like ready to supply into the future. But it is a very non-trivial ask.
It's one of those things that I feel like is just a piece of the puzzle of the broader solution to look at, rather than,
Yep.
like you said, I don't think anyone is wanting to say, oh, recycling gets us out of this entirely.
It just
Seems
doesn't. That's like
unrealistic.
a
It just
dream
doesn't.
world.
Yeah.
I would love
Yeah.
to live in set dream world. I think my life would be a lot easier, but unfortunately, we live here. And like
Yeah.
it's a great piece of the puzzle, and we should push for it as hard as we can because it is a piece of supply that we desperately need. But it is just a piece. We need to
Yep.
build new mines and definitely new processing.
I think that's the big takeaway. I'm excited to see how technology changes kind of over the next 5 to 10 years. I think we're going to kind of be in some new paradigms with
For
how
sure.
businesses can operate. But I think it's really important that we don't look at any kind of one thing like this is the solution and we put all our eggs in one basket, so to speak. So
We've been saved. I know, never fall into that trap.
yeah,
Because almost
yeah,
always no one is coming to save you. You have to save yourself, So like we
100%,
we
100%.
must push forward, right?
Yeah. And then I guess just to tie it back to the broader picture as we wrap up here, it is just so interesting to watch this dynamic play out on a global scale of you see China that is able to, act as a centralized power. And it's not only just in the critical mineral space, but you're seeing the same thing in the energy side of things as well. I mean, nuclear just being one small example of this. It provides such an interesting stage for competition across all of it with American on the global stage. So I'm an optimist by heart, so I remain optimistic about how America is going to rise to the challenge on it. But goodness gracious, there's a lot of things to figure out, and it's been really interesting to kind of dig into the critical mineral side of it here. I wanted to wrap up the conversation just talking about where your focus is going at a high level now, and then for young people that are looking into the space, as somebody that's young yourself and has had a really interesting kind of path into this, what your advice would be.
Yeah. Look, not so young anymore, but I'm happy to give advice to the young folks. Where is my focus? I continue to invest in space very actively, both through my family office and have two active SPACs. I also continue to advise on policy through Rice, and I'm very active kind of in discussions with the government where I can be helpful, like here to help, fly the flag. As long as I don't need to join the government. But no, jokes aside, I think it is ever more important to stay very focused on tangible assets in those unsexy, historically considered dirty industries. Like we need you, we need those skill sets. If I was a young person, like we need mining engineers, we need petroleum engineers, like we need people with real skill sets, we need trades. I think you could build a wonderful life for yourself. Studying those areas, and really moving the needle, both for yourself, your family, like you can make a ton of money. These are really well-paying gigs. But also like for your country, right? Like we need to develop these skill sets. And so I was given a piece of advice when I left business school by one of my friend's dads. His name's Barry Lafer. I think he's like the coolest person in the world. But he told me if you see everyone running in one direction, you need to run in the other direction. And everybody I was graduating with was going banking, consulting, and those are great. Like awesome. I like went to this weird like oil and gas startup in Fort Worth to go like learn from this guy, right? And I'm not saying that I took the right path, but I am very happy with how my career has played out, the expertise that I've developed, and how I'm positioned now. I'm hopeful that I'm able to both, serve the private sector and the investment community as well as my country.
That's such a big thesis for Mission Critical. We're seeing the vibe shift happen in real time in this country where people are starting to pay more attention to the trades. That seems like a better investment for a young person than college does in a lot of ways these days. And I think people are just ready to get back to building things in the physical world and working
Yep.
with their hands
So,
in some ways. And
yes.
I think that's only going to continue as we see artificial intelligence kind of make things all wonky a little bit and change the equations that a lot of our expectations and preconceived notions are built upon. So
Agree.
spot on with so much of that. Well, Ashley, this has been such an awesome conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Of
I wanted
course.
to give you a chance to just kind of plug where people can follow you. You've got an awesome LinkedIn that you post lots of great information on. So tell our audience where they can keep up with you.
Yeah, look, I'm like weirdly active on LinkedIn. Ashley Zumwalt-Forbes. I will be the only one with that name if you look it up. Would love to have you along for the ride. But really appreciate the time and absolute pleasure, guys.